Hi, this is Brenda Hornsby Heindl. I'm really excited to share my research for the new interpretive space of a kitchen garden at the James Polk House Museum in Columbia, Tennessee. As a consultant for this project, I was asked to make recommendations for a garden space adjoining the kitchen outbuilding, and additionally made recommendations for the kitchen building itself in interpretive space too. I love doing projects like this that incorporate so many of my interests, as I am a co-owner of a farm, have a variety of experiences with cooking and historic house and interpretive settings, and just generally love food and food history and gardening. So I hope that this presentation will be as enjoyable as the time I had to spend working with the material. Caroline O'Reilly Nicholson, who was a young woman at the time that the Polk family lived in the house, wrote in her journal later in life that a property located between the home of a John Kirk in Columbia and what she referred to as the Owen Place was cultivated in James K. Polk's, quote, garden products and such other home supplies as he had need of in town. And this is where the title of my presentation came from. And we're not really sure exactly where this was located, but it does give us a sense that while James Polk may not have had a garden directly on their house property there, that he was growing a food for the household somewhere other than out in the country. And so while we don't know exactly whether they were growing things right on the property behind the house, we do know that in the vicinity of the house, there were things being grown for consumption there and being used in the kitchen. So where is this new garden located? Many who are from the Columbia area are likely familiar with the Orman photography studio that had been in the same location for decades. This building was built in the second quarter of the 20th century, and it stood on the property until very recently. And let me see if I can pull up my little pointer here. For those of you that are not from there, this is what was the Orman studio there behind the Polk House. And so when this building was brought down, the opportunity to add the space to the Polk Museum arose, and it was taken, which ultimately brought the property back to its original size, as I will show here shortly. Where the photography studio once stood is now an open space, and it's a wonderful opportunity for this new interpretive space of a garden, and it gives programming opportunities for the garden as well as with the kitchen outbuilding and dining room to talk about food preparation as well as storage in the past. The garden that is planned is for a time frame of about 1810 to 1830, or roughly the first quarter of the 19th century. Because this is an imagined space, meaning that research using archaeology, historical publications, gardening resources, comparable houses, and landscapes were used to create the space, I took the opportunity to approach the project with a curatorial mindset as well. This meant that I wanted to make sure that the landscape was accessible, that it provided differently abled people the opportunity to enjoy the landscape, that it would have diversity not only for the varieties of plants as was historically correct, but also the opportunity to talk about free and enslaved individuals as well as Native Americans. And that the landscape would provide good opportunities for programming. It would be feasible with a small staff and volunteers to tend to the garden, and would also be responsible and make good stewardship with plants that are today considered invasive, or plants and trees with root systems that could become problematic. And so you'll see images I will have throughout the slides of what the space currently is looking like adjoining the kitchen. And this was started just this spring and summer. So we've got some raised beds, and we'll talk about other properties in the garden. And then this is part of the design that I created. In taking a look at the 18th century, and what a garden landscape incorporated, we find that many of the designs restricted the plants to particular areas. There was a little less blending of fruits, vegetables, and herbs. And while there were several styles of gardening in the 18th century, generally things were divided into separate spaces or beds. And we see a few gardens here, mostly from the colonial Williamsburg area, showing 18th century landscapes and designs. The reign of Queen Victoria began in 1837, and it seems like so much of the Victorian era, particularly later, went on the motto of more is better. And this image is of a painting titled The Library, and I think it really aptly shows a Victorian space with every inch covered with items. And you can kind of say the same thing about their gardens, too. So while I say that jokingly, Victorian Gardens not only returned to training the landscape into shapes, but provided an explosion of color and, again, generally a division of fruits, vegetables, and herbs, plus adding a bunch of stuff. So the Victorian era, particularly second half of the 19th century, you see this explosion of benches and fountains and gazebos and all these different things. And I think Victorian gardens sometimes tend to be rather busy. So roughly the first quarter of the 19th century was this in-between time, and it was a blending of colors and height and varieties, but also a little less of a separation of flowers, fruits, and vegetables. Today, I would say this is what we call perennial landscaping or edible landscaping, but it was historically touted as a colorful and responsible approach to a household garden or an urban landscape. It's hard to envision what a space like you see in the lower left corner, this new space that's being created, could look like in the future. But the two images there at the top of the screen, made by High Country Gardens in Texas, really shows you what a landscape potential has. So you see the image in the upper left where it was nothing there, and then on the right is what those plants they installed ended up being. And in the lower right is another 1830s garden setting in Raleigh, North Carolina at the Ellen Mordecai Garden. And again, showing this wonderful blending of plants and varieties and flowers and the potential of what this garden could look like there at the Polk House. So the space itself, this is a photograph of the Polk House. I'm going to pull up my laser pointer here again. So this is the Polk House here in the front corner. This photograph is from 1929. And as we'll see here in a minute, that's on some maps. This is the kitchen building, and these two spaces almost became adjoined in the early part of the 20th century. At one point there was a house here, and that lot space between the kitchen and that house is now where the kitchen garden is going. These images of the maps are from what are called Sanborn Maps. They're fire insurance maps from the 19th and early 20th century. And I'm going to pull up the laser pointer one more time. And we'll take a look here. This is the property. This is the Polk House here. This is the kitchen. So this is the sister's house, if you're familiar with the Polk House Museum. And here you have your offices and ticket house back here. So this whole property was once with the Polk House and this whole corner area. And now this is where that garden is being installed. And so this map from 1895 shows that at one point there was a walkway that was installed between the kitchen and the house. Then we see in the I'll go down here to the 1905 map. Not a whole lot of change going on in that property here in the corner at the Polk House. A little change getting ready to happen with the whole house and the porch. The 1914 map shows that there was a wooden structure put off the end of the kitchen, and the entire space between the kitchen and the house was filled in. But in 1914, nothing there in that space between that house and what was the kitchen became an office. And then here on our Google Maps, which has not been updated quite yet, this is the former Orman studio that has been since demolished. And this is the kitchen, and here is the Polk House. So again, this is the space we're looking at through here for the current kitchen garden. There was no archaeology to really speak of for this space because of several buildings having gone in. And so without archaeology of the Polk House to go off of, I did look at archaeology from other comparable places, including Andrew Jackson's The Hermitage, and visited there looking at not only the archaeology of their kitchen gardens and what they interpret and use for their cooking programs and other things, but also the gardens themselves have been archaeologically excavated. And it was really neat to see these reports because it not only talked about some of the materials that were found in the gardens, but it also mentioned letters showing the brick beds that you see here through here were mentioned in a letter from 1852 in which Sarah York Jackson, who was the wife of Andrew Jackson Jr., mentioned bricking around the beds. And so this method of decorating in the garden may not have been until later, but it is a really fascinating thing to see how the edging in the beds were completed there. Cold frames, or what are sometimes called hot boxes, were very popular in the 18th century and even used today for early preparation of vegetables and seeds, more like cold weather varieties. And so I have recommended putting one, maybe two varieties of cold frames here along the kitchen. So this is the outside of the kitchen wall. And then adding a couple cold frames for the kitchen. And these two cold frame styles over here are what are being used at Colonial Williamsburg. And really the design of a cold frame has not changed in several hundred years, and is great for interpretation for early varieties, but also for starting seeds and for early cold or weather materials. We'll start taking a look now at some of the varieties I recommended in my final report and why those items will be good for this landscape and for this project, but also how those could be incorporated into programming and themes. So most of the items that I recommended for the outer borders are perennials and considered a part of what a permaculture system might be. So again, regenerative plants that have a low maintenance. And however, the central raised beds that you see in the bottom central picture are intended to have annual plants that may include vegetables, possibly herbs, or they could also be fallow if there isn't someone available to maintain them, which was also done historically. Vegetables are certainly an important part of a kitchen garden. I have an example in the upper left and upper right corners of a book from the early 19th century showing a calendar of things that you should be doing in your garden and things you should be growing and how to prepare them. And so there were a lot of things shown for what you should be planting and when, and how it should be prepared as well as preserved, eaten and cooked. And so a great complement to being next to a kitchen, of course, but also a wonderful interpretive opportunity because not everyone knows how food comes to the table. And so my own personal experience, having seen people never know what carrots look like when they're pulled out of the ground, is really a kind of an aha moment for people of all ages. And so having this space, having these raised beds, and the opportunity to do annual plantings with vegetables and other materials is going to be a really great programming opportunity for the museum. Gardens, even smaller household gardens in an urban setting, were encouraged to have fruiting plants as well as vegetables in their spaces. In the upper left-hand corner is an image of a Cornelian cherry. This variety was propagated here in America fairly early on and provided these rich red fruits that you see there in the hands, and you sometimes see them being specified for cooking varieties. Certainly strawberries are very popular. Kind of fun to associate, again, that idea of what you know from a grocery store and how it's grown. And strawberries are able to be a perennial plant. And then I think fun things to have in gardens are always items that people are going to be like, what in the world is that? So in the upper right is an example of what's sometimes called a nodding onion or an Egyptian walking onion. And if you ever have the chance to watch an Egyptian walking onion grow over time, what happens is the flower and seed head at the top literally ends up falling down to the ground and it replants itself. So it is a perennial and it continues essentially walking across a space as it regenerates itself throughout the season. But it's a really fun plant to talk about and was propagated here in America historically. Asparagus is not only one of my favorite vegetables, but it's just a beautiful, lush, and leafy variety that I've recommended for the space because it was very popular here in America for food, also for variety in a garden space, no matter how small. So even some small spaces would recommend having an asparagus plant, and these certainly do spread over time. But the plant itself is quite beautiful with the seeds and how they grow out through the season. And you see asparagus cultivation being detailed very specifically, as you see here with this 1830s book that had several sections on asparagus. And so this is a really fun plant to have in any garden, I would argue. Bees are definitely near and dear to my heart. I do have bees and certainly are a conversation piece in today's culture, and a lot of people are very aware of how important honeybees are to pollination, and it's great to have the opportunity to have local beekeeping groups be able to come in and talk about bees and the importance of bees. And so what I recommended to have in the garden are skeps, what I'm calling false skeps, because I did recommend that there's no space for bees to get into the skeps because they may take an interest in it. So what you see not only in the historic image in the upper left, but also in what is today in the garden, these skeps there in a small enclosure. These are what was being used almost up until the mid-19th century. What we think of today as hives were being developed slowly into the 19th century, and so people were still using these skeps in the early 19th century for having bees in their gardens, and it was quite a popular thing. But again, being responsible for patrons and acknowledging that some people may have allergies, while it would be lovely to have beehives there in town, without somebody to really maintain them, and also in using skeps, it would be preferred not to have actual bees, but give the opportunity for beekeepers to come in and bring observation hives and talk about the importance of bees there in the garden. Like the cornelian cherry, the quince has long been a part of the American landscape. Many recipes and historic cookbooks extol the virtues of the quince for jams as well as for wine. I also recommended this really quite beautiful fruit because it shows up with some frequency in cookbooks, including one that I found from 1866. And you'll see a copy of the cover there in the upper left corner. This is written by a woman named Melinda Russell, who was a free African American woman born in East Tennessee, but she worked through the mid-19th century as a cook in both Tennessee and Virginia. So this book that she published in 1866 was most of her recipes that she used while working there in Tennessee, and it included quinces and other materials. And I thought it would be a great conversation piece, not only because of the popularity of quinces, but also having this opportunity to talk about diversity and Melinda Russell and her recipes that she published in the 19th century with her experience as a cook there in Tennessee. Gooseberries are native to central and northeastern North America, but are also found in parts of the South, and you see them in cookbooks that are published in the South, including Melinda Russell's publication. They were popular for jellies and pies, as well as for distilling. And I think it would be great to have items that were used in distilling and brewing in the garden, because then they have a programming opportunity to bring in local distilleries and other places to have a programming opportunity of incorporating local businesses to share what they're doing, but also what people were doing historically using materials that were found locally. The passion flower or maypop vine is incredibly gorgeous. These wonderful flowers that I've seen quite often in the South and some gardens. But what's even more fun is that they fruit. And so they do produce fruit. And while this was being propagated in gardens, certainly by the second quarter of the 19th century, it was also medicinally used by Native Americans. So again, a diverse opportunity to talk about some Native American cultures that were using the maypops for medicinal purposes, but also the ability to have this gorgeous vine that produces a fruit that was also being used for food. Engaging people with the past, I think, has a lot to do with telling stories. And certainly using women's voices like Melinda Russell's, but also women's voices like Martha Turnbull, who was a mistress of Rosedown Plantation, which was in Louisiana. And a wonderful publication is her garden diary that she kept throughout the kind of the second quarter of the 19th century, but a little bit of an earlier time, and that she was propagating things, including what's sometimes called a wild peach, but was really what is the variety of a Carolina cherry laurel. And this plant was found historically in the South. And what I think is really interesting about this plant and why I recommended it for the landscape is that as surveyors came further and further west, they looked for plants like the Carolina cherry laurel because they talked about that, as well as native bamboo, or sometimes called switch cane, would indicate good soil for farming. And so surveyors would note when they would find these wild peaches, because that smell is sometimes referred to as a peach, when they would find the wild peach plants as good places for people to settle for farming. And so certainly being in the western part of Tennessee and talking about that migration and moving further west, the Carolina cherry laurel is a great interpretive plant. Mentioning natives and adding some variety to the landscape, we probably see more of what's called the Oakleaf Hydrangea that you see out there on the left. Gorgeous plant. Oakleaf hydrangeas are perennial but also a native, and they're native to southeastern North America. They were introduced to England by William Bartram from Philadelphia in the early 19th century. And on the right is a lovely bush, sometimes growing a little bigger into a tree called a fringe tree. It's also sometimes referred to as a Grancy graybeard. And it's also a native of the South. And Martha Turnbull, who was at Rosedown Plantation, as we mentioned, she was growing fringe trees and even propagating them, and has entries for them in her garden diary in the 1830s. And once you get a sense of what these trees look like, you'll sometimes see them even on the side of the road. And they're really a fun plant to start scoping out. So even while Daniel Boone was wandering through America in the 18th century, fig trees were being propagated here with some frequency. It is a plant that was originally from the Middle East. And but we see very early on that these plants were being brought to America, and we see them in recipe books, and I certainly love figs. And so figs are a plant that are pretty easy to propagate, and are also a great perennial to have in a garden landscape. I mentioned having a certain amount of responsibility and stewardship for the landscape. In the 19th century and throughout gardening history, we see an interest in plants, what might be considered today invasive species. So in the upper left are what's called a trumpet vine, beautiful flowers. However, they take over, and on the right, is what's called a star jasmine, sometimes called a Confederate jasmine. And then in the lower left are a variety of vining rose, as well as wisteria, which is another vining plant. Even the native can be quite out of control. And so while these plants were popular, even in the first quarter of the 19th century, I chose not to recommend them for this landscape, not only because of the maintenance, but also just to be nice to the neighbors in case they ever get out of hand and end up all over the place. The great part about the gardens in the first quarter of the 19th century is there's a lot of conversation about layers and combinations. And so you see ground rosemary and lamb's ear in front of taller varieties of plants and flowers. So hollyhocks and sunflowers, and sometimes a blending of annuals and perennials. But certainly things like hollyhocks can become a perennial. And so this great blending of colors, but also height and variety that sort of flows throughout the garden. Finally, no garden, whether urban or in the country, would be complete without fruit trees. And this is certainly something that has become more of a part of a conversation in the last couple of decades in saving and planting heritage varieties, particularly in the South. Apple tastings have been really popular programs at museums and at organizations hosting local orchards to discuss the varieties they grow and the history behind them. And the museum has already planted a few fruit trees. If you see, let me pull up one more time. Let me pull up my laser pointer. We have a few fruit trees that have been planted here along this fence line. And so that'll be really fun to see those grow. in the future. So this new landscape at the James Polk House Museum will be an opportunity to tell stories, to connect patrons to present issues in agriculture and foodways with historical contexts, and expand the opportunity for programming and interpretation. It will also be an accessible space, one with diverse possibilities, a flexible and feasible space for the staff, and allow the Polk House to be responsible stewards teaching about plants, food, and gardening in the past, present, and future. Thank you for this opportunity to share this research, and I hope you will have a chance to visit, volunteer with, or tune in and support the James Polk House Museum in all their endeavors.